They called them the most inbred twins ever raised by their grandmother. For 9 years, no one in Clay Hollow knew where the boys came from or what they were becoming. Behind a weather-stained cabin, hidden beneath a rusted stove, was a sealed root cellar that hadn't been opened since the war. Inside, a snapped crib, a rotted doll with its face scraped clean, and something scratched into the stone with broken teeth. The old woman said it was God's work. But the question is, what kind of God asks for that? If you would like me to continue creating stories so that this history, which is not taught in schools, is not forgotten, please subscribe to this channel. Write in the comments where you are watching from. The spring morning carried a bitter chill as Sheriff Elias Croft guided his horse through the dense Kentucky woodland. Dew still clung to the branches, and his boots left deep impressions in the red clay mud along the stream bank. The logjam where the body lay was a tangle of stripped birch and oak, nature's cruel cradle for young Emery Pike. Dr. Luther Cale knelt beside the corpse, his Confederate coat spread beneath him to keep the mud at bay. His iron spectacles caught the weak morning light as he methodically examined the boy's waterlogged remains. The doctor's stained fingers moved with practiced precision, marking each injury in his leather-bound notebook. "Sheriff, come look at these markings," Cale called out, his voice carrying the detached tone of a man who'd seen too much death to be shocked anymore. "The spacing here," he pointed to dark bruises on the boy's chest, "suggests a large predator. Bear tracks have been spotted near Miller's Creek this season." Croft dismounted, his oilskin coat heavy with morning damp. He stood over the scene, noting how small Emery looked in death. The boy's clothes, already threadbare in life, hung in muddy tatters. His feet were bare, the skin wrinkled from days in the water. "Those boots of his," Croft said, scanning the immediate area. "Good leather, weren't they? Remember seeing him wearing them in town last week. Church donation, I believe." He paused, scratching at his sun-hardened jaw. "Bears don't usually take boots, Luther." The doctor made a non-committal sound, continuing his examination. "These puncture wounds along the rib cage, consistent with ursine dentition. The water damage makes precise timing difficult, but I'd estimate death at 4, perhaps 5 days ago." Croft's attention fixed on the boy's neck. "That mark there," he pointed. "Straight as a fence post. Bears don't leave lines like that." "Likely from debris in the stream," Cale replied, though his pen hesitated above his notebook. "The current could have pressed him against a branch." The sheriff walked the bank, measuring distances in his mind. His gaze traveled upstream toward where the Whitlow cabin perched on its lonely rise. Smoke rose from its chimney, thin and gray against the morning sky. He'd need to question Dorcas' procedure, nothing more. The interview proved brief. Dorcas Whitlow stood in her doorway, rigid as a fence post, her ash-gray hair tucked beneath a spotless kerchief. The smell of camphor and vinegar clung to her dark wool dress. "Never saw the boy," she said, her words clipped and final. Behind her, through the cabin's dim interior, Croft caught a glimpse of 2 small figures, working in the kitchen, the Whitlow twins, silent as always. "We keep to ourselves here, Sheriff. God's eyes are enough for us." Back in his office that evening, Croft opened his private ledger, leather-bound, its pages filled with his careful hand. He found the entry from last week. Emery Pike, orphan, age 10, seen begging near Kendall's store. Below it, he added today's date and found deceased, stream behind Whitlow property. After a long moment, he took his pencil and made a small mark beside the boy's name, just a tiny cross, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. Dr. Cale's official report would read, "Death by animal mauling, post-mortem water exposure." The town would talk of bear attacks for a while, warn their children to stay close. But that mark in Croft's ledger would remain, a quiet question that couldn't quite rest. The June heat pressed down like a wet blanket as Sheriff Croft's horse picked its way along the rutted path to the Whitlow cabin. The untethered mule had been found 3 days ago, its leather harness intact but riderless, wandering near the crossroads at Clay Hollow. Now, studying the abandoned saddlebag retrieved from the thicket, Croft's weathered fingers traced the torn ledger page. Clay Hollow, 2 boys, he read aloud, the paper's edge ragged where it had been ripped. The rest of Clive Taggart's sales records lay scattered among folded squares of calico and tin buttons, as if hastily searched. Deputy Mason shifted in his saddle beside him. "Ma'am claims he only stopped for directions," he reported, mopping his neck with a bandana. "Says he never set foot inside. But that mule was found awful close to her property." The Whitlow cabin squatted ahead, its weather-grayed boards and sagging porch, unchanged since Croft's last visit 2 years ago. Smoke threaded from the chimney despite the summer heat. As they approached, movement caught his eye. 2 small figures darting between the blackberry bushes at the edge of the cleared yard. The twins, he realized, Jonas and Ezra, though he'd never learned which was which. They were barefoot, their dark hair hanging in their eyes, clothes stained with berry juice. One had a chipped front tooth, the other bore a long scar down his neck. Neither boy made a sound as they vanished into the undergrowth. Dorcas Whitlow met them at the door before they could dismount, her thin frame rigid in her customary black dress. The smell of camphor and vinegar cut through the afternoon heat. "Sheriff," she said, her voice clipped as ever, "I've told young Mason here all I know." The peddler stopped, asked the way to Pine Root, and rode on. "Never crossed my threshold. Those would be your grandsons I saw just now?" Croft kept his tone casual, though his hand moved to the field journal in his coat pocket. "I have no boys here." Dorcas's face might have been carved from wood. "Just me and the Lord's work. Funny thing about that." Croft withdrew the torn ledger page. "Mr. Taggart seems to have made note of 2 boys in Clay Hollow, right before he disappeared. Many boys in the hollow." Her eyes never wavered. "None here." Back in his saddle, Croft paused to make careful entries in his field journal. First, the official note. Clive Taggart, presumed missing. Last seen vicinity of Whitlow Cabin, Clay Hollow. Then, on the facing page, he sketched 2 small faces, one with a chipped tooth, one with a neck scar. The likeness wasn't perfect, but it captured something in their empty eyes that made his hand pause. Deputy Mason cleared his throat. "Think we ought to search the property?" Croft closed the journal, tucking it away. Without evidence of a crime, they had no cause. But he'd keep watching and waiting. The hollow held its secrets close, but patience was a lawman's best tool. "We'll log it," he said finally, "and we'll remember." The late afternoon sun filtered through the church's dusty windows as 9 men gathered around the scarred pine table in the vestry. Reverend Horace Dillard's fingers drummed against a leather-bound parish register, its pages open to births and deaths from 1873. "No formal record," he said, tapping the empty space where Sarah Whitlow's death should have been logged. "No minister called, no Christian burial rites performed." His voice carried the weight of 7 years' disquiet. Deacon Fuller, oldest among them, cleared his throat. "Perhaps in her grief, she drove me off with a Colt Navy revolver." Reverend Dillard's weathered face tightened at the memory, called it women's business, and said the Lord had already witnessed what needed witnessing. The council members shifted uncomfortably in their wooden chairs. Through the open window came the steady rhythm of the blacksmith's hammer from across the street, marking time like a metronome. "And now this business with the missing peddler," added Thomas Whitaker. stroking his grey beard. "Sheriff's been asking questions. The woman hasn't taken communion in 3 years," said Fuller. "Hasn't brought those boys to service once." Reverend Dillard pulled a fresh sheet of paper from his desk. "Brother James," he said to the youngest deacon present, "you rode out there yesterday. Tell us what you saw." James Carter straightened in his chair, his Adam's apple bobbing. Place was quiet, like too quiet. No chickens scratching, though there's a coop. Smokehouse padlocked in June, mind you. He paused, wiping his palms on his Sunday trousers. "But it was what I heard that troubled me most." The blacksmith's hammer fell silent. Through the window floated the sound of children playing near the schoolyard. "I was checking the property line, like you asked," Carter continued. "Behind the cabin there's this wall newer boards than the rest. And from behind it," he swallowed hard. "Well, it wasn't quite speaking, more like sounds an animal might make, trying to form words." Reverend Dillard's pen scratched across the paper as he began composing the ecclesiastical censure. The other council members watched in silence. "We'll request a formal inspection," the Reverend said, his pen never stopping. "Those boys need Christian instruction, at the very least." He looked up at Carter. "What else struck you as peculiar?" The young deacon twisted his hat in his hands. "It's like when you walk past a hen house at night, Reverend. You know the hens are there, but they're too still, too quiet. Something's made them that way." He set his hat on the table with trembling fingers. That's what that cabin felt like. A hen house without hens. The council murmured their agreement. As Reverend Dillard finished the censure, the document would go to the bishop tomorrow, carried by the Morning Post rider. Outside, the schoolyard had gone quiet, and long shadows crept across the vestry floor. 7 years was long enough to wait for answers about Sarah Whitlow's death. The church had been patient, perhaps too patient. The Reverend sanded the ink dry and affixed his seal. "Let it be recorded," he said, "that on this day the church seeks to inspect what has too long remained hidden." Thunder cracked across Clay Hollow as Sheriff Elias Croft guided his horse through the muddy road, followed by Tom Brewster's wagon. The carpenter held tight to his rain-slicked reins, while Dorcas Whitlow sat rigid beside him, her black dress plastered against the seat-boards. The morning storm had driven her into town, something Croft had never witnessed in all his years as sheriff. "Lightning took the top clean off," she'd said at his office, her voice clipped as ever. "Need it seen to before the whole roof catches." The cabin emerged through the rain, a dark shape against darker pines. Fresh splinters of limestone lay scattered across the yard, and the chimney's crown gaped like a broken tooth against the sky. Croft dismounted, his boots sinking into Kentucky clay. Inside, water dripped steadily through the damaged ceiling. The parlor stove, an old Franklin model, sat centered on what appeared to be a metal plate, its edges flush with the floorboards. Croft had seen hundreds of cabin stoves in his time. None mounted quite like this. "Ma'am," he said, removing his wet hat, "you might want to gather any valuables from this room. Tom here will need space to work." Dorcas's thin lips pressed together. "I'll fetch dry linens from the back storeroom." She disappeared down the narrow hallway, her footsteps creaking on the warped boards. The moment she was gone, Croft knelt beside the stove. "Tom," he whispered, "take a look at this mounting." Brewster set down his toolbox and crouched next to the sheriff. His calloused fingers traced the plate's edge. "This ain't right," he muttered. "See these hinges? And these latches here, iron, new, forged. This is a trapdoor, plain as day." Croft nodded. "Can you lift it?" The carpenter produced a pry bar from his box. Water dripped steadily as he worked the latches free. The metal plate groaned, revealing a black square beneath the stove. The smell hit them first, sharp vinegar masking something fouler. Urine, old and concentrated. Croft struck a match, and held it over the opening. Wooden steps descended into darkness. "Lord have mercy," Brewster breathed. The sheriff's match illuminated objects below. A small shirt with mother-of-pearl buttons, half buried in dirt. A broken bed slat, its ends worn smooth. And propped in one corner, a cloth doll, its painted face scrubbed to bare canvas, the fabric around its neck charred black. Thunder shook the cabin. Croft heard Dorcas's footsteps returning down the hall. "Close it," he hissed. "Quick and quiet." They had just secured the last latch when she reappeared, arms full of folded sheets. Her grey eyes darted between them. "Found the problem?" "Ma'am," Croft said, keeping his voice steady. "I'm going to need you to ride back to town with us once this rain lets up. Judge Fletcher arrives Thursday for circuit court. He'll want to ask you some questions." "Questions?" A muscle twitched in her jaw. "About what?" "About this property. And about those boys of yours." Croft met her gaze. "And about what's under your parlor floor." The sheets dropped from Dorcas's arms. Outside, lightning split the sky again, illuminating the cabin's windows like pale, watching eyes. Sheriff Croft found the twins perched on the back porch like two crows at sundown, their bare feet dangling over weathered boards. The evening air hung thick with coal smoke from distant mining camps, and crickets had begun their nightly chorus in the tall grass. Jonas and Ezra, if those were truly their names, sat perfectly still as Croft approached. Their black hair fell in identical tangles over their foreheads, and their homespun shirts bore matching patches at the elbows. Neither boy looked up when his boots creaked on the steps. "Evening, boys," Croft said softly, settling onto an upturned bucket nearby. "Mind if we talk a spell?" The twin on the left, the one with the chipped front tooth, turned his head slightly, but his eyes remained fixed on the darkening tree line. His brother didn't move at all. Croft reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a cloth-wrapped biscuit he'd gotten from the boarding-house kitchen. The honey-sweet smell drew no reaction from either child. He set it between them on the wooden planks. "Might be you're hungry," he offered. "Been a long day, I expect." Minutes passed. A whippoorwill called from the forest edge. Finally, the twin on the right, the one with the wider-set eyes, reached for the biscuit with trembling fingers. His brother's hand shot out, gripping his wrist. "Mama says no words but God's," the first boy whispered, his voice raw as if from disuse. The second twin withdrew his hand and began making soft, keening sounds, perfect imitations of mourning doves at dusk. His brother joined in, their calls echoing across the yard in eerie harmony. Croft watched them, his stomach knotting. He'd seen traumatized children before, orphans from the war, victims of abuse, but nothing like this calculated emptiness. The next morning, Miss Elaine Greer arrived at his office just after sunrise. Her hands shook as she smoothed her dark skirts, but her voice remained steady as she recounted events from 6 years prior. "Sarah came to me in secret," she stated, watching Croft record her words. "Said she had twin boys who needed schooling. She was so young herself, barely more than a child. But there was something desperate in her eyes." "Did you ever see these boys?" Croft asked, his pen scratching across the official affidavit paper. "No, sir. She promised to bring them the following Monday." Miss Greer twisted her handkerchief, but when she returned, her wrist was wrapped in dirty linen. Blood had soaked through her dress front. "She wouldn't meet my eyes, just whispered, 'I was wrong,' and hurried away." She drew a shuddering breath. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. Croft finished transcribing, then pushed the document across his desk. "You understand this contradicts Mrs. Whitlow's account of her daughter's death in childbed?" "I do." Miss Greer's signature was careful and clear at the bottom of the page. "And I've carried the weight of my silence long enough." By noon, Croft had the affidavit sealed in an official envelope. He saddled his horse for the ride to London, where Circuit Judge Fletcher held court. The paper felt heavy in his saddlebag, a single thread pulled loose from a tapestry of lies that had shrouded Clay Hollow for nearly 7 years. The spring rains came sudden and fierce to Clay Hollow, turning the packed dirt roads into rivers of red mud. Water rushed down from the ridgeline, tearing through old fence posts and carrying away anything not firmly anchored to the earth. Josiah Bell trudged through the aftermath, his oilcloth coat heavy with moisture. His hound, Max, ranged ahead, sniffing at disturbed ground where his steel traps had been set. The flooding had exposed new patches of earth, laying bare secrets long buried beneath leaves and soil. The morning sun barely penetrated the fog that clung to the hollows when Max's bark echoed sharp and urgent from around a creek bend. Bell found the dog pawing at something pale protruding from the mud, something that shouldn't have been there. "Back, boy," he commanded, kneeling to examine what had caught the hound's attention. His weathered fingers brushed away wet clay to reveal what he'd feared: a human bone, bleached white by time. Following the debris trail, Bell discovered more remains scattered downhill by the flood waters. His eyes tracked the path back to its source, a partially collapsed structure behind the Whitlow house, its entrance newly exposed where rushing water had carved away years of accumulated brush and dirt. The root cellar's timber supports had rotted through, causing one wall to cave inward. Bell's hands shook as he lit his brass lantern. The flame's glow revealed 3 distinct bundles wrapped in oilcloth, bound carefully with hemp twine, arranged like cordwood against the far wall. He didn't need to unwrap them to know what they contained. The shapes told enough. Within the hour, Sheriff Croft arrived with the Laurel County coroner, Dr. Marcus Wade, who had ridden through the night from London. The doctor's examination was methodical, his voice steady as he dictated notes to his assistant. "Male child, approximately 10 years of age," Wade announced, carefully unwrapping the first bundle. "Bone structure and remaining clothing consistent with descriptions of Emery Pike." He paused, pointing to distinctive marks on the neck vertebrae. "Note linear compression damage here, likely from a rope or cord." The second bundle contained similar remains, though these were smaller. The third yielded not only bones, but also a small metal object, a harmonica, its reed plates green with corrosion. Wade held it to the light, reading the faint engraving. "To Levi, from your sister." "Levi Barnum," Croft said quietly. "Went missing from Williamsburg 7 years back. His family searched for months. By midday, the county clerk had drafted a notice for immediate distribution. Official inquiry from the Office of Laurel County Administration. Information is hereby requested regarding any male children reported missing between the years 1873 and 1881, whose last known trajectory included passage through or near Clay Hollow, Kentucky. Relevant details should be forwarded to Sheriff Elias Croft or County Clerk Thomas Whitaker with utmost haste. All communications will be held in strict confidence." The notice went out by telegraph to surrounding counties, while workers constructed a tent over the excavation site. Rain continued to fall, and more earth was sloughing away from the old cellar walls, revealing darker spaces behind. Deputy James Hawkins wiped sweat from his brow as he chiseled loose another brick from the Whitlow cabin's chimney base. The afternoon sun streamed through dirty windows, casting long shadows across the empty parlor. 3 hours of methodical searching had yielded little until his tool struck something hollow, a cavity behind the masonry. "Sheriff," he called out, already working his fingers into the gap. "There's something here." Sheriff Croft crossed the creaking floorboards, his boots leaving prints in the disturbed dust. Together, they extracted a rusted tin box about the size of a family Bible, its lid sealed with hardened wax. Dr. Cale joined them at the kitchen table as they pried it open. The physician's hands, usually steady from years of surgical work, trembled slightly as he lifted out the contents one by one. "Dear God," he whispered, arranging small teeth in a row, far too many to have come from just two boys. Beneath these lay coils of dark hair, tied with faded ribbons, some still bearing traces of dried blood at the roots. But it was the torn journal pages that drew their focus. The handwriting was precise, almost beautiful in its careful loops and flourishes, belying the horror of the words themselves. "The Lord sends sons where the law will not." The second page contained only a list of dates and initials, spanning nearly a decade. Dr. Cale cleared his throat. "I've served as physician to every family within 20 miles of Clay Hollow since the war. Not once was I called to attend any births at this property." He adjusted his iron spectacles, voice hardening. "Those boys, all of them, they simply appeared, with no records, no questions asked." The sheriff nodded grimly. "And no one looked too hard at a widow raising her grandchildren." He spat the last word, like it tasted bitter. By sunset, Judge Harrison had reviewed the evidence in his London chambers and signed the warrant. But when deputies surrounded the Whitlow cabin at dawn the next morning, they found only cold ashes in the hearth and a half-eaten breakfast on the table. Dorcas had vanished. Within hours, telegraph operators in 3 cities clattered out the same urgent message: wanted for questioning. Deaths of multiple children. Clay Hollow, Kentucky. Dorcas Whitlow. Female, age 62, gray hair, stern bearing, typically wears dark wool dress, speaks with mountain accent, known to quote scripture, approach with caution, telegraph. Sheriff E. Croft, Laurel County. Immediately, courier riders departed at first light, carrying daguerreotypes showing Dorcas's sharp features and unwavering stare to law enforcement offices across the state. But it was a letter delivered 3 days later that broke the case wide open. Written in careful penmanship on church letterhead from Hazard, it read, "Dear Sheriff Croft, a woman matching your description attended our Wednesday service. She wore a distinctive brass ring, which caught my eye during communion. When she raised the cup, I clearly saw the engraving WSD Eternal. She gave her name as Mrs. Ida Lorne, claiming to be traveling to Cincinnati to visit an ailing sister. In his service, Reverend Thomas Blackwood, First Presbyterian Church of Hazard." The sheriff immediately dispatched riders toward the Ohio River. The hunt for Dorcas Whitlow had begun. The prayer house in Hazard stood empty after morning service, sunlight filtering through its dusty windows onto worn wooden pews. Only 2 figures remained: Preacher Abram Heath and a woman in a dark wool dress who had introduced herself as Mrs. Ida Lorne. "Would you care to join me in reciting Psalms?" Preacher Heath asked, his Bible open before them, his eyes fixed on the brass ring adorning her right hand, the same distinctive band mentioned in Sheriff Croft's circular. The woman's fingers twitched. "I know the Lord's words by heart," she said, her voice carrying a familiar mountain lilt. "Then perhaps the 23rd? He watched her closely. She began to recite, but her words came halting and wrong, mixing verses with private prayers. Her hands trembled as she gripped the pew. "Sister," Heath said quietly, "I believe there are some gentlemen who wish to speak with you." 2 deputies emerged from the vestry, followed by Sheriff Croft himself, trail dust still coating his long coat. The woman, Dorcas Whitlow, didn't resist as they secured her wrists. She merely smiled, a thin expression empty of warmth. "The clean ones stay," she whispered, eyes fixed on some distant point. Sheriff Croft supervised as deputies searched her traveling bag. Inside, they found bundles of dried herbs tied with twine, a half-empty vial of laudanum, and a folded paper containing 10 boys' names written in her precise hand. Some had small crosses marked beside them. "Mrs. Whitlow," Croft said. You'll be transported to London for questioning regarding certain matters in Clay Hollow." She didn't acknowledge him, continuing to whisper, "The clean ones stay," as they led her to the waiting wagon. The journey to London took 6 hours over rutted roads. Dorcas remained silent throughout, refusing water and food. Only her lips moved in constant prayer, the same 4 words repeated like a charm. At the courthouse, Clerk Thomas Wainwright recorded her processing, noting in his ledger, "Subject maintains unusual calm, whispers continuously, appears to be reciting personal liturgy." He documented her few possessions: the brass ring, engraved DWSD, Eternal, a small Bible with pressed flowers marking certain passages, and the list of names they'd found. When asked about the boys, Dorcas finally spoke clearly. "God gives children to those who keep them pure." The circuit judge ordered her held without bond until the April 15th hearing. That same afternoon, Sheriff Croft dispatched deputies to remove Jonas and Ezra Whitlow from their grandmother's cabin. The twins, now 9 years old, were found sitting motionless on their shared bed, wearing clean shirts and holding identical tin cups. "Mama says wait," they said in unison when approached. Dr. Cale examined them briefly before signing commitment papers for the Eastern Kentucky Asylum. "Severe developmental arrest," he noted. "Speech limited to mimicry. No apparent understanding of basic social concepts." The boys were loaded into a covered wagon just before sunset. Neither looked back at the cabin as they departed. In their room, deputies found identical scratches on the wall beside each pillow, 10 parallel lines, precisely spaced. "The clean ones stay," Dorcas whispered again in her cell that night, fingers tracing where her brass ring had been. "The clean ones stay." Oil lamps cast long shadows across the London courthouse as spectators packed the wooden benches. The air hung thick with coal smoke and whispered prayers. Miss Elaine Greer smoothed her dark skirts as she took the witness stand, her hands steady despite her pale complexion. "Sarah came to me in the spring of '74, Miss Greer testified, her voice clear in the hushed chamber. "She wanted to enroll 2 boys twins," she said, "but when I asked their ages, she couldn't answer, just kept touching her wrist, where the bruises showed purple beneath her sleeve." Dr. Cale followed, setting his leather case beside the witness chair. He extracted a cloth-bound journal recovered from the Whitlow cabin, its spine damaged where pages had been torn out. The remaining entries suggest a pattern of isolation and ritualized behavior, he stated, adjusting his iron spectacles. The author misses. Whitlow references cleansing games and tests of purity. 10 pages are missing, apparently removed with deliberate force. In the front row, Jonas and Ezra Whitlow sat flanked by asylum orderlies. Jonas stared ahead, seemingly fascinated by the dust motes dancing in the lamplight. Ezra rocked slightly, his whispers barely audible. "No more dirt under, no more dirt under." Reverend Dillard's testimony drew gasps from the gallery. "Sarah confessed to me in confidence," he said, gripping his Bible. She spoke of her mother taking her to what she called the Lord's bed. The twins were born of this unholy union. When I confronted Dorcas, she threatened me with a pistol, claiming divine authority. The journal was entered into evidence, its remaining pages documenting years of calculated cruelty. Dorcas sat unmoved as the clerk read passages describing the underground chamber where she'd kept the boys. Her only reaction came when he reached an entry dated May 1873. "The Lord gives children to those who keep them pure. What grows in darkness stays clean." The jury deliberated less than an hour. Judge Harrison pronounced the death sentence, setting the hanging for April 18th. But Dorcas had other plans. On the morning of April 16th, guards found her slumped in her cell, an empty laudanum vial hidden in the spine of her hymnal. Her final message was scratched into the limestone wall with a piece of charcoal. "What I made was better than what was made of me." Dr. Cale performed the autopsy, noting in his report that her hands still smelled of camphor and vinegar. The missing journal pages were never recovered, despite thorough searches of the cabin and grounds. The twins were transferred to separate wards at the asylum. Jonas responded well enough to basic care that he was eventually released under supervision. Ezra remained institutionalized, spending his days drawing intricate patterns of parallel lines on any surface he could reach. Years later, a factory foreman in Paducah hired a quiet man who gave his name as Jonas Whitlow. He worked the soap vats without complaint, speaking only when necessary. A night watchman reported finding D.W. repeatedly carved into the underside of his bunk, but when questioned, the worker merely hummed and stared at his hands, as if searching for something that wouldn't wash away.